The winter wind cut through Eleanor's thin shawl like a blade as she pushed open the door to Miller's General Store in Dodge City, Kansas, her breath forming clouds in the frigid December air of 1878. She had walked 3 miles from the outskirts of town where she'd been camping in a borrowed wagon, her fingers numb and her stomach hollow, knowing she needed proper supplies if she was going to survive another week alone on the frontier. The bell above the door jingled, and Harold Miller looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing the moment he recognized her. Eleanor Dawson was 22 years old, unmarried, and traveling alone. 3 facts that had made her the subject of whispered gossip since she'd arrived in Dodge City 2 weeks ago. She'd come west after her father's death back in Ohio, hoping to claim the small parcel of land he'd won in a card game years before. But the reality of frontier life had proven far harsher than she'd imagined. "Miss Dawson?" Miller said, his tone cold and clipped. "What can I do for you?" Eleanor approached the counter, pulling her small coin purse from her pocket. She'd been working odd jobs where she could find them, mending clothes and taking in washing. But the money came slowly, and winter waited for no one. "I need supplies, Mr. Miller. Flour, salt, coffee if you have it, and a knife." She watched Miller's face as she said the last word, saw his expression harden. "I can sell you the dry goods, but I will not sell you a knife." The words hit her like a physical blow. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me correctly." Miller crossed his arms over his chest. "A woman alone, no husband, no family. You come in here asking for a weapon. What kind of establishment do you think I run?" Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks, despite the cold still clinging to her skin. "Mr. Miller, I need a knife to prepare food, to cut kindling, to survive. I am not asking for a gun or ammunition, just a simple hunting knife. And I am telling you no." Miller's voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of the 2 other customers in the store. "It is not proper for a woman in your situation to be carrying such things. If you need help, you should seek out the church or find yourself a husband to provide for you." Eleanor's hands trembled, and she could not tell if it was from cold or rage or the humiliation of being refused something so basic, so necessary. She had faced condescension and judgment since arriving in Dodge City. But this felt different. This felt like a door slamming in her face when she was already struggling to breathe. "The knife costs 40 cents, she said quietly, setting the coins on the counter. "I have the money." Miller did not even look at the coins. "I said no." The door behind Eleanor opened again, letting in another gust of winter wind and something else. A presence that seemed to fill the entire store. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor, and Eleanor turned to see a man who looked like he'd walked straight out of the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the window behind him. Dark hair fell past his collar, slightly wild and touched with melting snow. His face was weathered and strong, with a thick beard covering his jaw and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore buckskin and wool, layers that spoke of someone who knew how to survive in the harshest conditions. And he moved with the easy confidence of a predator in its own territory. Eleanor found herself taking an involuntary step back. Though whether from fear or something else entirely, she could not say. The man's gaze swept the store, taking in the scene with those sharp gray eyes. They lingered on Eleanor for a moment, on her thin clothing and the coins still sitting on Miller's counter, before moving to the shopkeeper. "Miller," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "You refusing to conduct business?" Harold Miller's demeanor changed instantly. "Mr. Marlowe, good to see you. I am simply explaining to Miss Dawson here that certain items are not appropriate for a woman traveling alone. Vincent Marlowe. Eleanor had heard the name spoken in town, usually in hushed tones. He was a mountain man who came down from his cabin in the hills a few times each season to trade furs and stock up on supplies. The stories about him varied wildly. Some said he'd been a soldier in the war. Others claimed he'd killed a grizzly bear with his bare hands. A few whispered that he'd lost his family to an Indian raid and had retreated to the wilderness to escape his grief. Vincent moved closer to the counter, and Eleanor noticed the way he walked, silent despite his size, like something wild that had learned to move through the forest without disturbing a single leaf. "What item are we discussing?" "A knife," Eleanor said before Miller could respond. She lifted her chin, meeting Vincent's eyes directly, even though it required tilting her head back to do so. "I need a knife for basic survival tasks. But Mr. Miller has decided that my gender makes me unworthy of purchasing one." Something flickered in Vincent's expression, too quick for Eleanor to identify. He turned back to Miller. "Show me the knife she wants." Miller hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but he reached beneath the counter and produced a simple hunting knife with a 6-inch blade and a wooden handle. It was nothing fancy, just a practical tool, exactly what Eleanor needed. Vincent picked up the knife, testing its weight and balance with the practiced ease of someone who had carried such implements his entire life. He examined the blade, checking the edge, then nodded. "How much?" 40 cents, Miller said. "But Mr. Marlowe, I really do not think—" "I will take it." Vincent pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted out the coins, placing them on the counter with a solid clink. Then he turned to Eleanor, holding the knife out to her. She stared at it, at his large, calloused hand wrapped around the handle, at the offering being made. "I cannot accept that. I have my own money." "I know." Vincent's voice was quiet but firm. "Take it anyway. I do not need charity. It is not charity." He continued to hold the knife out, patient as stone. It is one person helping another. That is how people survive out here. Eleanor felt something tight in her chest begin to crack. She had been alone for so long. First in the months after her father's death, and then on the journey west, and then in the cold reality of Dodge City, where she was viewed with suspicion and judgment at every turn. This stranger, this mountain man who owed her nothing, had just given her something that Miller had refused to sell. She reached out slowly and took the knife from his hand. Their fingers brushed for just a moment, and she felt the rough texture of his skin, the warmth that spoke of vitality and strength. "Thank you," she whispered. Vincent nodded once, then turned back to Miller. "Now let us discuss the rest of her supplies." The lady mentioned flour, salt, and coffee. Miller's face had gone red, but he did not argue with Vincent Marlowe. He began gathering the items Eleanor had requested, measuring out portions and wrapping them in brown paper. Vincent watched him work, his presence a silent pressure that kept the shopkeeper honest and attentive. When the supplies were assembled, Eleanor reached for her coin purse again, but Vincent was faster. He counted out the additional money before she could protest. "Mr. Marlowe, please," Eleanor said, her voice strained. "I truly cannot accept this. You have already done too much." He looked at her again, and this time she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It was not pity, which she would have hated. It was something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he saw in her a reflection of himself. "Where are you staying?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. She did not know this man, did not know if she could trust him despite what he had just done. But something in his steady gaze made her answer honestly. I have a wagon on the edge of town, near the creek. Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That wagon has holes in the canvas. I saw it when I rode in. You will freeze to death out there before the week is through. I am managing. You are surviving. Barely. He gathered up her supplies, the packages looking small in his large hands. Come on. Come where? I have a room at the boarding house when I am in town. You can have it. I will sleep in the stable. Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks again, but this time it was from the sheer impropriety of what he was suggesting. I absolutely cannot do that. What would people think? People already think plenty about you, from what I have heard. Vincent's voice was blunt but not unkind. Right now, I am more concerned with keeping you alive than with gossip. He was right, and Eleanor knew it. She had spent the last 3 nights shivering in that wagon, piling every scrap of fabric she owned on top of herself, and still waking with ice in her hair. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Just for tonight, she said quietly, and I will repay you for everything. I swear it. Vincent did not respond to that. He simply pushed open the door and waited for her to follow. They walked through the streets of Dodge City together, an odd pair that drew stares from everyone they passed. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, her spine straight despite her exhaustion and cold. Vincent moved beside her like a mountain itself had decided to take a walk, his presence both intimidating and oddly comforting. The boarding house was a simple 2-story structure run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She was standing in the front parlor when they entered, and her eyebrows shot up at the sight of Eleanor. Vincent Marlowe, what is this? Mrs. Patterson, this is Miss Eleanor Dawson. She needs a warm room and a hot meal. I am giving her mine for the night. Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. And where will you be sleeping? The stable will do fine. I have slept in worse places. The older woman studied Eleanor for a long moment, taking in her worn clothing and pale face, the way she was trying so hard to maintain her dignity. Something seemed to soften in Mrs. Patterson's expression. Very well. But Miss Dawson, you will come down to the kitchen first and have some stew. You look half-starved. Eleanor wanted to refuse, to maintain some scrap of pride, but her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl that made refusal impossible. Thank you, madam. That would be most kind. Vincent set the supplies on a table and turned to leave, but Eleanor caught his arm without thinking. He stopped immediately, looking down at where her small hand rested on his thick forearm. Mr. Marlowe, I do not even know how to properly thank you. You have shown me more kindness in 1 hour than I have received since arriving in Kansas. I promise you, I will find a way to repay you. Vincent looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. You can start by eating that stew and getting some rest. We can discuss everything else tomorrow. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Mrs. Patterson led Eleanor to the kitchen, where a large pot of beef stew bubbled over the stove. The smell alone was enough to make Eleanor's knees weak. The older woman ladled out a generous portion and set it on the table along with thick slices of bread and butter. Eat, she commanded, and while you eat, you can tell me what brought a young woman like you to Dodge City all alone. Eleanor ate because she had no choice, her body demanding the sustenance even as her mind raced. But she also talked, finding herself telling Mrs. Patterson things she had told no one else. About her father's death from pneumonia, about the land deed he'd left behind, his only legacy besides debts, about her decision to come west because there was nothing left for her in Ohio except the charity of distant relatives who had made it clear she was a burden. Mrs. Patterson listened without interrupting, occasionally refilling Eleanor's bowl or cup. When the story was finished, she sat down across from Eleanor and folded her weathered hands on the table. "That land your father won, do you know where it is?" "About 15 miles north of here, near Crooked Creek. I have seen it once. It is raw land, no house, no barn. Just grass and rock and the creek running through it." "And what were you planning to do with it?" Eleanor met the older woman's eyes. "I was planning to build a life, to prove that I could survive on my own. But I have been here 2 weeks, and I have spent most of my small savings already. Winter is here, and I have no shelter worthy of the name. And men like Mr. Miller make it clear that a woman alone is not welcome to even the basic tools she needs to survive." Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. "Harold Miller is a fool, and his father was a fool before him. But Vincent Marlowe is not. That man does not help people unless he sees something in them worth helping. He saw something in you today. He saw someone pathetic and desperate." "No." Mrs. Patterson's voice was firm. "Vincent Marlowe has seen plenty of pathetic and desperate people in this town. He does not waste his time on them. He helped you because he recognized something. Strength, maybe. Or stubbornness. That man knows what it means to survive against odds, and he knows it when he sees it in others." Eleanor wanted to believe that, wanted to think she was more than just a charity case. But exhaustion was pulling at her now, the warm food and heated room making it impossible to fight off the bone-deep weariness that had been building for weeks. Mrs. Patterson seemed to notice. She stood and gestured toward the stairs. "Come on, let me show you to Vincent's room. You can sleep without fear tonight. No one enters my boarding house without my permission, and I keep a shotgun behind the front desk." The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed covered in quilts, a small table with a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the main street. It smelled faintly of pine and leather, scents that Eleanor was already beginning to associate with Vincent Marlowe. She set her few belongings in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the knife Vincent had bought for her. The wooden handle was smooth, worn by use, but well maintained. It was exactly what she needed, nothing more and nothing less. Practical, reliable, like the man who had given it to her. Eleanor lay down on the bed without even removing her dress, pulling the quilts up to her chin. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. Warm, protected. And as she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of storm-gray eyes and a voice like distant thunder. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. For a confused moment, she could not remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The store, Miller's refusal, Vincent Marlowe and his unexpected kindness. Eleanor sat up, her body protesting after weeks of sleeping on the hard wagon bed. She washed her face in the basin, did what she could to make herself presentable, and went downstairs. The dining room held several other boarders eating breakfast, but Eleanor's attention went immediately to the window, where she could see Vincent outside, talking to a man with a horse. Even from this distance, he looked larger than life, his breath steaming in the cold morning air as he gestured toward something down the street. Mrs. Patterson appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "He has been up since before dawn. Went to check on your wagon, from what I understand. Said the canvas is even worse than he thought." Shame and gratitude warred in Eleanor's chest. "I need to speak with him." "He will come in when he is ready. For now, sit down and eat. You need to keep your strength up." Eleanor forced herself to eat the eggs and biscuits Mrs. Patterson provided, though her stomach was tight with nerves. She had spent the night in a man's room, had accepted his charity and his protection, and now she needed to face him and figure out what came next. Vincent came in about 20 minutes later, stamping snow off his boots and pulling off his heavy coat. He looked even larger in the confines of the dining room, and several of the other boarders shifted nervously in their seats. But when his eyes found Eleanor, something in his expression gentled. He crossed to her table and sat down without asking permission, his long legs stretched out in front of him. Mrs. Patterson brought him coffee without being asked, and he nodded his thanks. "You look better," he said to Eleanor. "Less like you are about to collapse." Eleanor felt her cheeks heat. "Thank you, and thank you for the room. I slept better last night than I have in months." Vincent nodded, sipping his coffee. Up close, Eleanor could see the details she had missed yesterday. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the silver threading through his dark hair at his temples, the way his hands, large and rough, handled the delicate coffee cup with surprising care. "I went to see your wagon," he said. "It is not safe. Even if you patch the canvas, the frame is rotting. It will not make it through the winter." Eleanor's heart sank. She had known the wagon was in poor condition, but hearing it stated so bluntly made it impossible to ignore. "I see. I also rode out to see your land." She looked up sharply. "You did what?" "At dawn. It is only 15 miles. I wanted to see what you were working with." Vincent set down his coffee cup and met her eyes. "It is good land, Miss Dawson. The creek runs year-round, there is timber for building, and the soil looks rich. With the right work, you could build a decent homestead there. But you cannot do it alone. Not through winter. You need help." Eleanor's spine stiffened. "I am not asking anyone to take care of me, Mr. Marlowe. I came west to be independent, not to become some man's burden or obligation. I am not offering to take care of you." Vincent's voice remained level, unaffected by her sharp tone. "I am offering to help you build a cabin on your land. In exchange, you can help me with my own cabin up in the mountains. I need someone to help preserve the winter stores, to cook and mend, and keep things running while I am hunting and trapping. It would be a fair trade. Work for work." Eleanor stared at him, trying to understand what he was truly proposing. "You want me to come live in your cabin? I am suggesting that we help each other survive the winter. I will teach you what you need to know about frontier life, about building and hunting and preparing for the seasons. You will help me manage the daily tasks that keep a household running. When spring comes, we will build your cabin on your land, and you will have the skills and supplies you need to make a real go of it." It was logical, practical. Everything Vincent seemed to be. But Eleanor could not ignore the reality of what people would say, what they would assume about a young woman living alone with a man in the mountains. "Mr. Marlowe, I appreciate the offer, but surely you can see how inappropriate such an arrangement would be. Your reputation is already damaged just by being here alone." Vincent's interruption was gentle but firm. "People have already made up their minds about you. You can either worry about their opinions and freeze to death in that wagon, or you can do what you need to do to survive." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she could not find the words. He was right. She had felt the weight of judgment from the moment she arrived in Dodge City. The whispers, the closed doors, the assumptions about her character based solely on her circumstances. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. "Why would you help a stranger this way?" Vincent was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Because I know what it is like to have nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Because I see someone fighting to survive on her own terms, and that is worth respecting. And because I could use the help, and you clearly need to learn, and that makes us useful to each other. His words were matter of fact, but Eleanor sensed something deeper beneath them. Pain, perhaps, loss, the kind of scars that did not show on the outside but shaped everything underneath. If I agreed, she said slowly, there would need to be clear boundaries, separate sleeping areas, a purely practical arrangement. Of course. And I would keep track of every cent, every favor. When I can repay you, I will. Vincent's expression might have held a hint of amusement. You can try. Eleanor took a deep breath. She was standing at a crossroads, and the path forward required trust in a man she barely knew. But what choice did she have? She could cling to propriety and die slowly in that freezing wagon, or she could take the hand being offered and fight for survival. She extended her hand across the table. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Marlowe. Thank you. His hand engulfed hers, warm and solid and reassuring. Vincent, if we are going to be living in the same cabin, we should probably use first names. Eleanor. She managed a small smile despite her nervousness. And I promise you, I am a hard worker. You will not regret this. Vincent released her hand and stood. We should leave today. There's a storm coming in tomorrow, and I want to be home before it hits. Can you be ready in an hour? Eleanor thought of her meager possessions, everything she owned in the world fitting into 2 small bags. Yes, I can be ready. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Vincent purchased additional supplies from a different store, one where the owner did not question his choices or refuse his money. He packed everything onto a sturdy mule while Eleanor gathered her belongings and said goodbye to Mrs. Patterson. The older woman hugged her tightly. You are making the right choice, girl. Vincent Marlowe is a good man, one of the best I have known. He will keep you safe. How do you know? Eleanor whispered. Everyone else in town seems afraid of him. Mrs. Patterson pulled back and smiled. They are afraid because they do not understand him. Vincent survived things that would have broken most men. He learned to live on his own because the world made it clear he was not welcome in polite society. But that does not make him dangerous. It makes him strong. And right now, you need that strength. Eleanor nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes. Mrs. Patterson was the first person in Dodge City to show her genuine warmth, and leaving felt like losing something precious. Come back in the spring, Mrs. Patterson said. Come back and show me that you survived, that you built something real. That is how you can thank me. By the time Eleanor stepped outside, Vincent had 2 horses ready, along with a mule loaded with supplies. He helped her mount the smaller horse, his hand steady on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle with effortless strength. Have you ridden much? He asked. Some. My father had a horse when I was young. This mare is gentle. She will follow my horse without much guidance. Just hold on and try to stay relaxed. They rode out of Dodge City as the winter sun climbed higher in a pale sky. Eleanor looked back once at the town that had offered her so little welcome, then turned her face forward, toward the unknown, toward the mountains and the man riding ahead of her, his broad back straight and his dark hair catching the light. The landscape opened up around them, vast and beautiful and terrifying. Snow covered the ground in patches, and the wind cut through Eleanor's shawl despite the layers beneath. But Vincent seemed unbothered by the cold, moving through the wilderness like he was part of it. They rode for hours, stopping once at midday so Vincent could check the horses and let Eleanor walk around to restore circulation to her legs. He handed her a piece of dried meat and hard bread, simple trail food that nonetheless tasted good to someone as hungry as she had been for so long. "How much farther?" Eleanor asked. 3 more hours, maybe 4. We will make it before dark." Vincent scanned the horizon, his eyes noting things Eleanor could not see. The cabin is in a valley between 2 ridges. Good protection from the worst of the winter winds. And the creek runs close enough for water, but not so close that it floods in spring. "You built it yourself?" "Most of it. I had help from a few trappers the first year, but I have done most of the work since." He glanced at her. "It is not fancy. No glass windows, no wood floors. But it is solid and warm, and it has kept me alive through 5 winters now." Eleanor tried to imagine what it would be like, living in such isolation. "Do you never get lonely?" Vincent was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Lonely is different than alone. I have been lonely in rooms full of people. I have been alone in the mountains and felt more at peace than anywhere else. It depends on what you are looking for." There was a story there, Eleanor sensed. A history that explained why a man like Vincent had chosen to live apart from the world. But she did not ask. They barely knew each other, and some stories required time and trust before they could be told. The sun was low on the horizon when they finally crested a ridge, and Eleanor saw the cabin below. It was larger than she had expected, built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and there was a small barn beside it, along with what looked like a storage shed and a chicken coop. "Who has been keeping the fire going?" Eleanor asked. "I have a neighbor of sorts. Tom Wheeler, another trapper. He watches my place when I go to town, keeps the fire from going out completely. I do the same for him." They rode down into the valley as darkness gathered. Vincent dismounted and helped Eleanor down, and she was grateful because her legs felt like water after so many hours in the saddle. He led the horses into the barn, and Eleanor followed, watching as he removed their saddles and bridles with practiced efficiency. "I will show you how to care for them tomorrow," he said. "For tonight, let us just get you inside and warm." The cabin's interior was dim but welcoming. A fire burned in the large stone fireplace, and the space was divided into clear areas. A kitchen section with a cast-iron stove and rough wooden counters. A sitting area with 2 handmade chairs near the fire. A table with benches for eating. And at the far end, separated by a heavy curtain, what must be the sleeping area. Vincent lit several lanterns, and warm light filled the space. Eleanor could see now the details that spoke of a man living alone. Everything was functional and well-maintained, but there were no decorations, no softness, no sense of it being anything more than shelter. "You can have the bed," Vincent said, gesturing toward the curtained area. "I will make up a pallet near the fire." Eleanor looked at the curtain, then back at him. "That is your bed. Your home. I cannot displace you." "You are not displacing me. I am offering." His tone left no room for argument. "You need proper rest if you're going to be any use around here." The bluntness of his words should have offended her. But instead, Eleanor found them almost comforting. Vincent was not coddling her or treating her like she was fragile. He was simply stating facts and expecting her to deal with them. "Then thank you. Again. I seem to be saying that a lot. You will earn your keep. Trust me." Vincent moved to the stove and began pulling out supplies. "Can you make coffee?" "Yes." "Then do that while I heat up some stew. We need to eat and get to sleep." Tomorrow I will start teaching you what you need to know to survive a winter in the mountains." Eleanor removed her shawl and moved to the stove, finding the coffee and the pot and beginning the familiar process. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Vincent moving around the small space, his presence filling the cabin in a way that should have felt oppressive, but somehow did not. They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming Eleanor from the inside out. After they finished, Vincent showed her where things were stored, explained the basic layout of the cabin, and pointed out the chamber pot behind a screen in the corner. "Water for washing is in the barrel by the door. I will refill it from the creek in the morning. If you need anything during the night, I will be right here." He gestured to the spot near the fire where he had already laid out blankets and a bedroll. Eleanor nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all. She was in a cabin in the mountains with a man she had met only yesterday. She was about to sleep in his bed while he slept on the floor. Tomorrow he would begin teaching her how to live a life completely foreign to everything she had known. But she was also warm, fed, safe, and that counted for more than she could ever express. "Good night, Vincent," she said quietly. "Good night, Eleanor." She slipped behind the curtain and found a simple rope bed covered in furs and wool blankets. The bed was made for someone much larger than her, and she felt almost lost in it. But it was comfortable and clean, and it smelled of pine and winter air. Eleanor lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Vincent settling in by the fire. The crackle of flames, the soft rustle of blankets, and beneath it all, the mountain silence that was so different from town noise, so deep and profound that it was almost a presence of its own. She thought about the knife still tucked in her pocket, the knife Vincent had placed in her hand when the shopkeeper had refused. That single act of kindness had changed everything, had set her on a path she never could have imagined. Eleanor did not know what the future held, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt something that might have been hope. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and exhilarating. Vincent woke before dawn each morning, starting the fire and beginning the endless round of chores that kept them alive. And he expected Eleanor to wake with him, to learn by doing rather than watching. He taught her how to care for the horses, how to muck out stalls and measure feed and check for injuries or illness. He showed her how to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, how to preserve meat in the cold storage shed, how to melt snow for water when the creek froze too thickly to break through. Vincent was a patient teacher, but a demanding one. He did not accept excuses or allow Eleanor to claim something was too hard. When she struggled to split kindling with a hatchet, he adjusted her grip and made her try again until she got it right. When she burned the cornbread, he simply told her to pay better attention to the heat of the stove and try again the next day. But he also noticed when she was pushing herself too hard. More than once, Eleanor looked up from some task to find him watching her with those storm-gray eyes, and he would quietly tell her to take a break, to warm herself by the fire, to eat something. They talked while they worked, small conversations that gradually revealed pieces of each other's histories. Eleanor learned that Vincent had fought in the war, that he had come west afterward because he could not stand to be in crowded places anymore. She learned that he was 30 years old, that he had been living alone in the mountains for 6 years, and that he preferred the company of animals to most people. Vincent learned that Eleanor had taught school before her father's death, that she loved books and could recite poetry from memory, and that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide that refused to let her quit, even when she was exhausted and sore. "You are tougher than you look," he said one afternoon as they worked together to repair a section of the barn wall. Eleanor paused, hammer in hand, and looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation." but there was something in his expression that might have been approval, and Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with physical exertion. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The winter storm Vincent had predicted rolled through, dumping 2 feet of snow and keeping them inside for 3 days. They spent that time on indoor tasks, with Vincent teaching Eleanor how to tan hides and mend leather while she read aloud from the few books he owned. Vincent's voice when he read was halting and uncertain, and Eleanor realized with some surprise that he was not fully literate. So she began teaching him in the evenings, using the same methods she had used with her students back in Ohio. He was a quick study when it came to physical skills, but reading required a different kind of patience. "Why did you never learn properly?" Eleanor asked one night as they sat by the fire, a book open between them. Vincent's jaw tightened. "My family was poor. I worked from the time I could walk. There was no time or money for school. But you are learning now. Because you are a good teacher, and because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because I am tired of being ignorant, of having to ask others to read things for me or just guessing at what words say." Eleanor felt a surge of affection for this man, who could survive anything the wilderness threw at him, but still felt shame over something as simple as reading. "You are not ignorant, Vincent. You know more about survival and the land than anyone I have ever met. Reading is just another skill, like tracking or hunting. You can learn it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. There was something in his gaze that had not been there before, a warmth and awareness that made her heart beat faster. "You are a good woman, Eleanor Dawson," he said quietly. "Better than I deserve to have helping me." "That is not true." Her voice came out softer than she intended. "You saved my life, Vincent. I would have died in that wagon without your help. You would have found a way. You are a survivor. So are you." They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Charged, aware. The space between them seemed to shrink, even though neither moved. Eleanor went to bed that night with her thoughts in turmoil. She had come to the mountains out of necessity, had accepted Vincent's help because she had no other choice. But somewhere in the weeks of working alongside him, of watching his quiet competence and experiencing his unexpected kindness, something had shifted. She was not supposed to develop feelings for him. This was a practical arrangement, nothing more. But practical arrangements did not explain why her pulse raced when he smiled at her, why she found herself watching the way firelight played across his features, why she felt safer with him than she had ever felt with anyone. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter and colder, and the world beyond the cabin became a frozen landscape of white and gray. But inside, the cabin felt warm and alive, in a way Eleanor suspected it never had before. She cooked meals that were more than simple sustenance, using the supplies Vincent brought in and the herbs she found in his stores. She mended his clothes, replacing buttons and patching tears he had been ignoring. She organized his shelves, cleaned corners that had gone neglected, and brought a sense of order that the cabin had been missing. And Vincent noticed. She could tell by the way his eyes lingered on the table when she set out a proper meal. By the way, he ran his hand over a shirt she had mended, feeling the careful stitches. By the small smile that touched his lips when he came in from the cold to find the cabin warm, and the smell of baking bread filling the air. One evening in early January, Vincent came in from checking the trap lines with a deer slung over his shoulders. It was a good-sized doe, and he set to work immediately butchering it, his movements efficient and practiced. Eleanor watched from where she was stirring a pot of beans, fascinated despite herself by the way he worked. There was something almost beautiful about his competence. The way his hands knew exactly what to do, the strength in his arms as he wielded the heavy knife. He looked up and caught her staring. What? Eleanor felt her cheeks heat. Nothing. I was just thinking that I should learn how to do that. Butcher game, I mean. If I am going to live on my own land, I will need to know. Vincent studied her for a moment. It is not pleasant work. I did not come to the frontier expecting pleasant work. Something that might have been pride flickered in his expression. He rinsed his hands and gestured for her to come closer. All right, I will show you. He talked her through the process, explaining the cuts and how to separate meat from bone, which parts to save and which to discard. Eleanor forced herself to ignore her squeamishness and pay attention. This was survival. This was the knowledge she needed. Vincent guided her hands with his own when she struggled, his touch firm but gentle. Like this. See? Follow the line of the joint. Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence behind her, his body heat warming her back, his breath stirring her hair. Her hands trembled slightly, though she told herself it was just from the effort of working with the knife. Good, Vincent said softly. You are doing well. They worked together until the deer was fully butchered, the meat wrapped and stored in the cold shed. Eleanor washed her hands thoroughly, trying to scrub away the blood and the strange intimacy of the moment. That night, she lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind replaying the feel of Vincent's hands on hers, the rumble of his voice so close to her ear. She was in dangerous territory, she knew. Developing feelings for Vincent could only complicate things. When spring came, she was supposed to return to her own land, to build her own life. That was the plan. That was what made sense. But her heart was not interested in sense. The next morning, Tom Wheeler showed up at the cabin. He was a wiry man in his 50s, with a gray beard and a laugh that echoed through the valley. He took one look at Eleanor and grinned. So the rumors are true. Vincent Marlowe has a woman living with him. Eleanor stiffened, but Vincent's voice cut through before she could respond. Miss Dawson is helping me through the winter in exchange for learning survival skills. It is a practical arrangement, Tom, and I would appreciate you treating it with respect. Tom held up his hands. No offense meant. It is just good to see you with company, Vincent. You have been alone up here too long. They invited Tom to stay for lunch, and Eleanor found herself liking the older man despite his teasing. He told stories of the frontier, of the years when trappers roamed these mountains in greater numbers, of the changes he had seen as civilization crept westward. This country is not what it was, Tom said, shaking his head. Too many settlers, too many towns. Another decade, and there will not be any wild places left. There will always be wild places, Vincent said quietly, just farther away from people. Deeper into the mountains. You planning to go deeper? Tom asked. Vincent glanced at Eleanor. I have not decided yet. After Tom left, Eleanor confronted him. What did he mean about going deeper into the mountains? Vincent was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. I have been thinking about moving my trap lines farther north, away from where the settlers are starting to spread. It would mean a more remote cabin, fewer trips to town. More alone, Eleanor said. Yes. She should have felt nothing about this. She should have simply nodded and accepted that Vincent's future plans were none of her concern. But instead, she felt something twist painfully in her chest. Is that what you want? To be even more isolated? Vincent looked at her, and for the first time, Eleanor saw uncertainty in his eyes. I thought it was. I have always been better on my own, better at a distance from people. But lately I have been wondering if I was just running from something rather than running toward anything worthwhile. Eleanor's throat felt tight. What changed? You did. His voice was low, almost rough. Having you here, it has made me remember what it is like to have company, to share meals and conversation, to wake up knowing someone else is under the same roof. I forgot how much I missed that. The air between them felt electric. Eleanor knew she should step back, should retreat behind the safety of propriety and practicality, but she could not make herself move. Vincent, He held up a hand. You do not have to say anything. I know this arrangement was never meant to be permanent. Come spring, you will go to your land and build your cabin. And that is as it should be. I just wanted you to know that having you here has meant something to me. More than I expected. Before Eleanor could respond, Vincent turned and walked outside, leaving her standing alone in the cabin with her heart pounding and her thoughts in chaos. That night, she barely touched her dinner. Vincent noticed, of course, but he said nothing. They sat by the fire as usual, but the easy companionship that had developed between them felt strained now, weighted down by things unsaid. Eleanor tried to focus on her mending, but her hands kept fumbling. Finally, she set the work aside and looked at Vincent directly. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked up from the leather strap he was repairing, his gray eyes steady on her face. Eleanor took a breath. When I came west, I was so sure of what I wanted. Independence, my own land, a life where I did not have to depend on anyone. But these past weeks with you, I have realized something. Independence is not the same thing as being alone. And depending on someone is not the same thing as being weak or helpless. Vincent set down his work, giving her his full attention. What I am trying to say is that I do not want to leave come spring. The words tumbled out in a rush. Or rather, I do want to build on my land, but I do not want to do it alone. I want to do it with you, if that is something you would consider. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, and she wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake, if she had misread everything between them. Then Vincent stood, crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, and knelt in front of her chair. He took her hands in his, dwarfing them with his size. Eleanor, I have been alone for so long that I forgot what it felt like to want someone's company, to look forward to seeing their face, to care about what they think or how they feel. His voice was rough with emotion. You have brought something back to life in me that I thought was dead. If you are willing to build a life with me, then I will build you whatever you want. A cabin, a barn, a whole damn ranch, if that is what you need. But I will not ask you to give up your independence for me. That is what you came west for, and I will not be the one to take it from you. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. You would not be taking it from me. I would be choosing to share it with you. That is different. Vincent's hands tightened on hers. Are you sure? Because once I commit to something, I do not let go easily. If you say yes to this, you are saying yes to all of me. The scars and the silence and the parts of me that are not easy to live with. And you would be saying yes to a stubborn woman who does not always know when to quit, who talks too much and has opinions about everything. Eleanor smiled through her tears. I think we can handle each other. Vincent made a sound that was half laugh, half groan. Then he stood, pulling her up with him, and before Eleanor could process what was happening, his mouth was on hers. The kiss was everything she had not let herself imagine, and more. Vincent kissed her like she was precious and necessary, like he had been holding himself back for weeks, could not do it anymore. His hands cradled her face with surprising gentleness, given their size, and Eleanor melted into him, her own hands gripping his shirt to keep herself steady. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I should marry you properly," he said, "before anything else happens, before people talk more than they already will." Eleanor laughed shakily. "Are you proposing to me?" "Yes, though I am doing a poor job of it." He pulled back to look at her. "Eleanor Dawson, will you marry me? Will you let me build you a cabin on your land and spend my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a mountain man with more scars than sense?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Vincent kissed her again, slower this time, savoring. When he lifted his head, his eyes held a light she had never seen before, something warm and alive and full of promise. "We will go to town as soon as the weather clears," he said. "Find a preacher. Do this right. Mrs. Patterson will be so pleased. Tom will never let me hear the end of it." But Vincent was smiling, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less burdened. They sat together by the fire that night. Eleanor tucked against Vincent's side, his arm around her shoulders. It felt natural and right, as if they had been doing this for years instead of mere weeks. "Tell me about the war," Eleanor said softly. "You do not have to if you do not want to, but I would like to know." Vincent was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he would refuse. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured. "I enlisted when I was 18. Thought it would be an adventure, a way to see the world beyond the small farm I grew up on. But war is not adventure. It is blood and mud, and watching boys you ate breakfast with die screaming in the dirt." Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand. "I fought in some of the worst battles. Shiloh, Antietam, Chancellorsville. I saw things that no person should see, did things that still wake me up at night." He paused, his jaw tight. "When the war ended, I tried to go home, but nothing was the same. My family had lost the farm. My parents died while I was gone, and I found I could not stand to be around people anymore. The noise, the crowds, the way they all wanted to pretend the war had been glorious. So I came west, kept moving until I found these mountains, and I built a place where I could be alone with the ghosts." "You are not alone anymore," Eleanor said firmly, "and you do not have to carry those ghosts by yourself." Vincent looked down at her, and something in his expression cracked open. "How did I get this lucky? How did a woman like you end up needing help on the same day I walked into that store? Maybe it was not luck. Maybe it was meant to be." They slept separately that night, propriety still holding despite their engagement. But Eleanor went to sleep smiling, her hand touching the knife Vincent had given her, the knife that had started everything. The weather cleared 3 days later, and they made the journey back to Dodge City. Mrs. Patterson cried when they told her the news, then immediately began making plans for a small wedding at the boarding house. "You will be married here, with a proper meal after," she insisted. "I will not have you getting hitched in some cold church with no celebration." The preacher was surprised but willing, and within a week, Eleanor found herself standing in Mrs. Patterson's parlor in a simple blue dress borrowed from the widow, with Vincent beside her in his cleanest clothes, his hair trimmed and his beard neatly shaped. Tom Wheeler attended, along with Mrs. Patterson and a few other townspeople who had been kind to Eleanor. Harold Miller was noticeably absent. which suited Eleanor just fine. The ceremony was short and simple. Vincent's hand was steady as he slid a plain gold band onto Eleanor's finger, and his voice did not waver when he promised to love and protect her for the rest of his life. When the preacher told him to kiss his bride, Vincent cupped Eleanor's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. This man who had seen so much darkness, who had retreated from the world, was choosing to open himself up to her, to trust her with the vulnerable parts of himself he kept hidden. The celebration afterward was warm and genuine. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a feast, and Tom regaled them with stories that made even Vincent laugh. As the evening wore on, Eleanor found herself watching her new husband, marveling at the way he was trying so hard to be social and comfortable, despite his natural inclination toward solitude. When they finally left to return to the cabin, loaded down with gifts and good wishes, Eleanor felt like her life had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer alone. She was no longer fighting for survival by herself. She had a partner, someone who would stand with her against whatever came. The winter months passed in a cocoon of growing intimacy and deepening love. Vincent taught Eleanor everything he knew, and she taught him in return, sharing stories and ideas and dreams for the future. They talked late into the nights, learning each other's histories and hopes. And they grew comfortable with each other in all the ways that married people do. Vincent no longer slept by the fire, but shared the bed with Eleanor. And she discovered that his strength extended to a surprising gentleness in private moments. He held her like she was something precious, made love to her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. "I never thought I would have this," Vincent confessed one night as they lay tangled together beneath the firs. "A wife, a home that feels like more than just shelter. Someone who knows all my broken pieces and stays anyway." "You are not broken," Eleanor said fiercely. "You are strong. You survived. And now we will build something beautiful together." When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth, they began work on the cabin at Eleanor's land. True to his word, Vincent built her everything she had dreamed of. A solid cabin with a stone fireplace and real glass windows he had brought from town. A barn for animals, a chicken coop, a garden plot ready for planting. Tom helped when he could, and a few other trappers Vincent knew stopped by to lend hands. Eleanor cooked for them all, feeding the workers and slowly building relationships with these rough men who had become their community. By midsummer, the cabin was complete. It stood on Eleanor's land, built with her husband's hands and her own labor, a testament to everything they had overcome. They moved in on a warm July day, carrying their belongings from Vincent's mountain cabin to this new home. It was smaller than his place, but felt more like theirs, something they had created together. That first night in the new cabin, Eleanor stood on the porch and looked out at the land that was hers by deed, but theirs by right of building. Vincent came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Are you happy?" he asked. Eleanor leaned back into his solid warmth. "More than I ever imagined possible. Do you remember that day in Miller's store, when he refused to sell me the knife?" "I remember. I thought it was the worst thing that could happen. Being denied something so basic, feeling so powerless and alone. But if he had just sold me the knife, I would never have met you. I would be living in some sad little shanty somewhere, surviving but not living. Instead, I have you. I have this home. I have a future that looks nothing like what I planned and everything like what I needed." Vincent turned her in his arms to face him. "That knife was the first thing I ever gave you, but it will not be the last. I promise you that, Eleanor. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes to me. I could never regret you, Eleanor said, reaching up to touch his face. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. They kissed as the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here, all the hardships and struggles and moments of despair. Every single one had been necessary to bring her to this place, to this man, to this life. The years that followed were not always easy. The frontier demanded constant work and vigilance. But Eleanor and Vincent faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge overcome. Their first son was born the following spring, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. They named him James, after Vincent's father. And Vincent held his son with a mixture of wonder and terror that made Eleanor fall in love with him all over again. I do not know how to do this, he confessed, staring down at the tiny bundle in his arms. How to be a father. The same way we figured everything else out, Eleanor said. Together, more children followed over the years. A daughter named Sarah 2 years later, then another son they called Thomas after their friend Tom Wheeler. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Vincent adding rooms and Eleanor filling them with warmth and laughter. Vincent proved to be a devoted father, patient and protective, teaching his children the same skills he had taught Eleanor. He took James hunting as soon as the boy was old enough to walk, showed Sarah how to ride a horse before she could barely reach the stirrups, and carried young Thomas on his shoulders through the forest, pointing out animal tracks and edible plants. Eleanor taught them all to read and write, determined that her children would have the education neither she nor Vincent had received in full. She filled their evenings with stories and songs, creating a home that was rich not just in survival skills, but in culture and knowledge. Tom Wheeler became a fixture in their lives, a beloved uncle to the children and a trusted friend to both Eleanor and Vincent. Mrs. Patterson visited when she could, traveling from Dodge City to see the family and marvel at how much they had built. You did it, she told Eleanor one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching the children play. You survived. You built something real. I am so proud of you. Eleanor smiled, watching Vincent chase their giggling children around the yard, his laughter carrying on the wind. I did not do it alone. I never could have done it alone. That is the secret, though, is it not? Mrs. Patterson said. Knowing when to accept help, knowing when to trust someone enough to build a life with them. As the children grew, the frontier around them changed. More settlers arrived, towns expanded, and the wild places Vincent had known began to shrink. But their valley remained largely untouched, a pocket of wilderness where they could raise their family in relative peace. Vincent never did move his trap lines farther north. He told Eleanor one night that he had finally found something worth staying in one place for, worth being part of a community for. The ghosts from his past never fully left him, but they no longer controlled him, no longer drove him deeper into isolation. Eleanor's land flourished under their care. They added cattle, expanded the garden, and built up a modest but successful homestead. Eleanor sold eggs and vegetables in town, and Vincent's furs still brought good prices when he took them to the trading posts. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. On their 10th anniversary, Vincent gave Eleanor a new knife. This one was finer than the first, with a handle of polished wood and a blade that held its edge beautifully. But wrapped with it was the original knife, the one he had bought for her that first day in Miller's store. I kept it, he said. I wanted you to have both. The one that started everything and the one that represents everything we have built since. Eleanor held both knives in her hands, feeling the weight of them, the symbolism. Do you ever think about how different things might have been if Miller had just sold me the knife that day? Every time I look at you and our children, I thank God he did not. Vincent pulled her close, because his refusal brought you into my life, and that was the greatest gift I ever received. Years continued to pass. James grew tall and strong like his father, eventually marrying a girl from a neighboring homestead and building his own cabin nearby. Sarah became a teacher, starting a small school in the growing community. Thomas showed his father's love for the wilderness, spending months at a time in the mountains trapping and hunting. Eleanor and Vincent grew older together, their hair turning gray and their movements slowing. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something comfortable and essential, like the air they breathed. On quiet evenings, they still sat together by the fire as they had in that first winter, Eleanor reading aloud or simply talking about their day. Vincent's reading had improved over the years until he could manage most books on his own, but he still liked listening to Eleanor's voice, said it soothed something in him that nothing else could touch. When Vincent turned 55, Tom Wheeler passed away peacefully in his sleep. They buried him on a hill overlooking his cabin, and Vincent was quiet for days after, grieving the loss of one of his oldest friends. It is strange, he told Eleanor. For so many years, I thought I wanted to be alone. I thought other people were the problem. But now I realize that connection is what makes life worth living. Tom knew that. He tried to tell me, but I was too stubborn to listen. You learned eventually, Eleanor said, taking his hand. That is what matters. More grandchildren arrived as the years advanced, filling their home with noise and joy during visits. Eleanor loved being a grandmother, loved seeing pieces of herself and Vincent in these new little faces. Vincent was patient with the grandchildren in a way he had never been with anyone else, letting them climb on him and pepper him with questions about animals and the mountains. When Eleanor turned 60, she and Vincent took a trip back to Dodge City, wanting to see the place where their story had begun. The town had grown considerably, with paved streets and electric lights, changes that made Vincent shake his head in wonder and consternation. Miller's general store was still there, though Harold Miller himself had died years before. His son ran it now, and he had no idea of the significance the place held for the elderly couple who walked through its doors. Eleanor stood in the spot where she had stood all those years ago, young and desperate and alone. She thought about the woman she had been then, how terrified and uncertain she had felt, how close she had come to simply giving up. Vincent seemed to know what she was thinking. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and said, "You were so brave that day, standing up to Miller, refusing to let him see how scared you were. That is when I knew you were someone special. I did not feel brave. I felt terrified. Being brave does not mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway." He kissed her temple. "You taught me that." They visited Mrs. Patterson's grave before leaving town. The boarding house was now a hotel run by strangers, but they placed flowers on her headstone and told her spirit about their life, their children, everything they had built. Returning to their cabin felt like coming home in the deepest sense. This land, this place, had become so thoroughly theirs that Eleanor could not imagine living anywhere else. Every tree, every rock, every bend in the creek held memories of their years together. As they grew older still, Their children took on more of the heavy work. But Vincent remained active, insisting on checking his trap lines and caring for the animals. Eleanor tended her garden with the same dedication she always had, growing vegetables and herbs and flowers that brought color to their valley. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, the cabin bursting with noise and laughter. James made a speech about his parents' love being an inspiration to the whole family. Sarah read a poem she had written. Thomas presented them with a beautifully carved wooden box he had made, inlaid with both their initials. That night, after everyone had gone home and the cabin was quiet again, Eleanor and Vincent sat on their porch watching the stars. 30 years, Eleanor mused. It feels like both forever and no time at all. I would do it all again, Vincent said. Every hard winter, every difficult choice, every moment of fear or uncertainty. All of it, if it meant ending up here with you. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. Do you ever miss it? The solitude? The life you had before? Not even for a second. His arm tightened around her. You and our family, this life we built, it is worth more than all the peace and quiet in the world. You saved me, Eleanor, from a life of loneliness and regret. You gave me purpose and joy and more love than I ever thought I deserved. We saved each other. Eleanor corrected. I was drowning when you found me. We both were, in our own ways. We just happened to be what the other needed. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had weathered decades together and come out stronger for it. The night air was cool but not cold. And somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its call echoing across the valley that had been their home for so long. Vincent's health began to decline when he was in his early 60s. The years of hard living, of pushing his body to its limits, had taken their toll. He developed pains in his joints that made movement difficult, and his breathing grew labored after even short walks. Eleanor nursed him with the same fierce determination she had brought to every other challenge in her life. She made him special teas and poultices, adjusted their routines to accommodate his limitations, and refused to let him sink into despair. I am slowing you down, Vincent said one afternoon, frustrated after having to stop multiple times on a walk to their favorite spot by the creek. You could never slow me down, Eleanor said firmly. We have always moved at our own pace, together. That has not changed. But as months passed, it became clear that Vincent's strength was fading. The children wanted them to move closer to town, where there was a doctor, but Vincent refused. I will die in the home I built with my own hands, he said. On the land that brought me my greatest joy. I will not spend my last days in some strange place surrounded by strangers. Eleanor understood, even as her heart broke at the thought of losing him. They had built this life together, and it was only right that they finish it together in the place they loved most. Vincent's last summer was bittersweet. He could no longer do much physical work, but he spent hours sitting on the porch, watching Eleanor tend her garden, listening to the sounds of the forest, and talking with the children and grandchildren who visited frequently. One evening in late August, with the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold, Vincent called Eleanor to sit beside him. He took her hand in his grip still strong despite his illness. I need you to promise me something, he said. Anything. When I am gone, do not mourn too long. Live, Eleanor. Keep working the land. Keep teaching the grandchildren. Keep filling this place with the light you have always brought to it. Promise me you will not waste your remaining years in grief. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I cannot promise not to grieve you. You are the love of my life, Vincent. You always will be. I know. And I am the luckiest man whoever lived because of it. He lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles. But grief should not be all that is left of what we built. Remember the joy, Eleanor. Remember the love. And let that carry you forward. I promise, she whispered. But I want you to know that every good thing in my life came from that day you walked into Miller's store. Every bit of happiness, every moment of love. It all started because you saw me and decided I was worth helping. You changed everything for me. Vincent smiled, the same smile that had transformed his face all those years ago. You changed everything for me, too. I was half dead when I met you, just surviving, but not living. You reminded me what it meant to truly be alive. They sat together as darkness fell, holding hands and watching the stars emerge one by one. It was a night like so many others they had shared, but it felt precious in a way that made Eleanor's chest ache. Vincent died peacefully 3 weeks later, in his sleep, with Eleanor beside him. When she woke to find him still and quiet, his face relaxed and at peace, she did not scream or cry out. She simply held his hand and whispered goodbye to the man who had been her partner, her protector, her greatest love. They buried him on the land he had claimed as his own, with a simple marker made by Thomas's skilled hands. The entire family gathered for the funeral, along with friends and neighbors whose lives Vincent had touched over the years. People spoke of his kindness, his strength, his loyalty to those he cared about. Eleanor stood by the grave and spoke last. Vincent Marlowe was the bravest man I ever knew, not because he fought in a war or survived in the wilderness alone, but because he let himself love again after loss. Because he took a chance on a desperate woman in a general store and changed both our lives forever. I will carry him with me for whatever time I have left, and I will make sure his legacy lives on in our children and their children. The grief was hard in the weeks that followed, harder than anything Eleanor had faced before. The cabin felt empty without Vincent's presence, without his quiet strength filling the spaces. But she had made him a promise, and Eleanor Dawson Marlowe had never broken a promise in her life. She continued to work the land, tending her garden and caring for the animals. She taught her grandchildren to read and write, passing on the knowledge Vincent had worked so hard to gain. She told stories about their life together, making sure the younger generations understood the love and sacrifice that had built their family. On quiet evenings, Eleanor would sit on the porch and hold the 2 knives Vincent had given her. The first one, worn and simple, that had started everything. The second, fine and beautiful, that had represented how far they had come. Both were precious to her, symbols of a love that had sustained her through 3 decades of frontier life. Eleanor lived another 5 years after Vincent's death. She remained active and engaged, a matriarch to a growing family, a respected member of the community. When her own time came, she went peacefully in her sleep, much as Vincent had, and her children found her with a smile on her face and those 2 knives clasped in her hands. They buried her beside Vincent, reuniting them in death as they had been in life. The marker Thomas carved for her was simple but profound. Eleanor Dawson Marlowe, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She chose courage over comfort and love over fear. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations. James's children eventually took it over, maintaining it with the same care their grandmother had shown. The knives were preserved too, kept in a place of honor, along with the story of how they came to be. And sometimes, on winter evenings when the wind howled through the valley, people swore they could hear laughter coming from the old cabin. the sound of two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a love that transcended the hardships of their time, who had proven that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected moments. A refusal from a prejudiced shopkeeper, a mountain man who saw someone in need, a knife placed in a trembling hand. These were the small moments that had changed everything, that had created a legacy of love lasting long beyond the lives of those who lived it. In Dodge City, which had grown into a proper town with paved streets and modern conveniences, older residents still told the story of Eleanor Dawson and Vincent Marlowe. It became something of a local legend, the tale of a desperate woman and a mountain man whose chance meeting had turned into one of the great love stories of the frontier. The story was embellished over the years, as stories tend to be, but the core remained true. A woman in need, a man who helped without being asked, a knife that represented both survival and trust, and a love that had sustained them through everything life on the frontier could throw at them. Years turned into decades, and the frontier itself faded into history. The wild places Vincent had known were tamed or disappeared entirely. The old ways of living, the trappers and mountain men, became relics of a bygone era. But in that valley where Eleanor and Vincent had built their life together, something of the old spirit remained. Their descendants continued to work the land, each generation adding their own chapter to the family story, but never forgetting the foundation Eleanor and Vincent had laid. The cabin was eventually renovated and expanded, but the original structure remained at its heart, a testament to Vincent's skill and dedication. The knives were eventually placed in a museum, part of an exhibit on frontier life. People would stop and read the placard explaining their significance, learning about the couple whose love story they represented. Children would press their faces close to the glass, staring at these simple tools and trying to imagine the lives they had touched. But the truest memorial to Eleanor and Vincent was not in any museum or monument. It was in the family they had created, the values they had instilled, the example they had set of what it meant to choose love over fear, courage over comfort, connection over isolation. Their great-great-grandchildren would gather around fires on cold winter nights and hear the story told again. About a woman who refused to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. About a man who had closed himself off from the world until one person gave him a reason to open up again. About how a simple act of kindness in a general store had rippled outward, affecting lives that had not even been born yet. The story always ended the same way, with the storyteller holding up a photograph of Eleanor and Vincent in their later years. It showed them sitting on their porch, Eleanor's head on Vincent's shoulder, both of them smiling at something outside the frame. They looked weathered and worn, marked by years of hard living, but also content, fulfilled, complete. That is what real love looks like, the storyteller would say. Not the easy kind that exists when everything is perfect, but the kind that is forged in hardship and strengthened by struggle. The kind that chooses to stay when leaving would be easier. The kind that sees another person at their worst and says, "I am still here." And the children would listen, wide-eyed and wondering, and carry that story forward into their own lives. Some would even find their own versions of it, their own unexpected meetings that would change everything, their own chances to choose courage and connection over fear and isolation. In the end, that was the true legacy of Eleanor Dawson and Vincent Marlowe. Not the land they had claimed, or the cabin they had built, or even the family they had raised. It was the example they had set, the proof they had provided that love could exist even in the harshest circumstances, that two broken people could come together and create something whole and beautiful and lasting. The knife that had started it all? That simple tool Vincent had placed in Eleanor's hand when she was at her lowest point had represented so much more than just a means of survival. It had been an act of faith, a gesture that said, "I see you. I recognize your struggle, and I believe you are worth helping." That belief, that recognition, had saved Eleanor's life in more ways than one. And in return, she had saved Vincent, pulling him back from the isolation he had retreated into after the war, giving him a reason to engage with life again, to build and love and hope. Their story was proof that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the most profound impacts, that a moment of kindness in a frontier general store could ripple outward through time, affecting generations not yet born. That refusing to accept no for an answer, whether it came from a prejudiced shopkeeper or from life itself, could open doors that seemed permanently closed. Eleanor and Vincent had lived and loved and died as all people do. But the impact of their choices, the legacy of their love, that lived on, in the valley where they had made their home, in the family that carried their blood and their values forward, in the story that continued to inspire others to reach out, to take chances, to believe that connection was worth the risk. And somewhere, perhaps, their spirits remained in that cabin they had built together, watching over the land they had loved and the family they had created. Two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had chosen to build a life worth remembering. That was the true end of their story, not in death, but in the continuing life they had made possible. In every grandchild who learned to read by firelight, using the same methods Eleanor had used with Vincent. In every young couple who heard their story and decided to choose love over practicality. In every person who extended a hand to someone in need, remembering that simple acts of kindness could change everything. The shopkeeper had refused to sell her a knife, seeing only a woman alone and making assumptions about her worth. The mountain man had bought it himself and put it in her hand, seeing instead her determination and recognizing a kindred spirit. And from that single moment, from that one choice to help rather than judge, an entire legacy had been born. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations, because it reminded people of what was possible when they chose compassion over judgment. When they reached across the divides of circumstance and convention to help another human being. When they recognized that sometimes the greatest adventures, the deepest loves, the most meaningful lives came from the most unexpected beginnings. Eleanor and Vincent's love story was one for the ages, not because it was easy or perfect, but because it was real and hard-won and built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. They had seen each other clearly, flaws and strengths alike, and had chosen to build a life together anyway. And that, in the end, was what made their story worth telling, worth remembering, worth treasuring. Not the dramatic moments or the grand gestures, but the daily choice to stay, to work, to love, to build something lasting in a world that often felt temporary and harsh. The knife had been just a beginning. The love had been everything.